So, hello and welcome back yet again as we finish up this third tale in this old book that we are reading that began with the strange adventures of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, moved on through Fortune Wildred, and now we are learning the story of Lizzie Leigh. Except we aren't really learning her story. We're learning a lot more about her mom and her brothers and this other woman who seems to be the sainted wonderful woman, and we haven't learned much about Lizzie at all. Like I said before, I was pretty darn sure that Susan, the love interest of Will, was actually going to turn out to be Lizzie. I was wrong, but I felt like that was where the story was going. Now I'm kind of curious, since we seem to be getting indications that this little girl, Nancy, is Lizzie's daughter, and that Lizzie is still somehow alive because money keeps mysteriously showing up. This is a very convoluted tale, and nothing wrong with that. Now I want to see how it's going to end. So that is what we're going to do. It has grown much cooler. I kind of find it hilarious that less than a week and a half ago I was probably sweating. It was definitely much warmer, and now I'm starting to think that winter's coming on. The weather changes in an instant, that is for sure. But it's just the way of the world. Anyway, we're going to jump back in and we are going to finish up Lizzie Leigh by Elizabeth Gaskell, a interesting story of Victorian times. That night, Mrs. Leigh stopped at home, that only night for many months. Even Tom the scholar looked up from his books in amazement, but then he remembered that Will had not been well, and that his mother's attention having been called to the circumstance, it was only natural she should stay to watch him. And no watching could be more tender or more complete. Her loving eyes seemed never averted from his face, his grave, sad, careworn face. When Tom went to bed, the mother left her seat, and going up to Will, where he sat looking at the fire, but not seeing it, she kissed his forehead and said, "Will, lad, I've been to see Susan Palmer." She felt the start under her hand, which was placed on his shoulder, but he was silent for a minute or two. Then he said, "What took you there, mother?" "Why, my lad, it was likely I should wish to see one you cared for. I did not put myself forward. I put on my Sunday clothes and tried to behave as you had liked me. At least I remember trying at first, but after I forgot." She rather wished that he would question her as to what made her forget everything, but only he said, "How was she looking, mother?" "Will thou see never set eyes on her before, but she's a good, gentle-looking creature, and I love her dearly, as I've reason to." Will looked up with momentary surprise, for his mother was too shy to be usually taken with strangers, but after all, it was natural in this case, for who could look at Susan without loving her? Still, he did not ask any questions, and his poor mother had to take courage and try again to introduce the subject near to her heart. But how? "Will," she said, jerking it out in a sudden despair of her own powers to lead to what she wanted to say, "I telled her all." "Mother, you've ruined me," he said, standing up and standing opposite to her with a stern, white look of affright on his face. "No, my own dear lad, do not look so scared. I have not ruined you." She placed her 2 hands on his shoulders and looked fondly into his face. "She's not one to harden her heart against a mother's sorrow. My own lad, she's too good for that. She's not one to judge and scorn the sinner. She's too deep read in her New Testament for that. Take courage, Will. And thou mayest, for I watched her well, though it's not for one woman to let out another's secret. Sit thee down, lad. Thou lookest very white." He sat down. His mother drew a stool towards him and sat at his feet. "Did you tell her about Lizzie then?" he said, hoarse and low. "I did. I telled her all, and she fell a-crying over my deep sorrow and a poor wench's sin. And then a light comed into her face, and trembling and quivering with some new glad thought, and what dost thou think it was, Will lad? Nay, I'll not misdoubt but that thy heart will give thanks as mine did afore God and his angels for her goodness. That little Nanny is not her niece. She's our Lizzie's own child, my little grandchild." She could no longer restrain her tears, and they fell hot and fast, but still she looked into his face. "Did she know it was Lizzie's child? I do not comprehend," he said, flushing red. "She knows now, but she did not at first, but took the little hopeless creature in out of her own pitiful loving heart, guessing only that it was the child of shame, and she's worked for it and kept it and tended it ever since it were a mere baby, and loves it fondly. Will, won't you love it?" she said beseechingly. He was silent for an instant and said, "Mother, I'll try. Give me time, for all these things startle me. To think, Susan, having to do with such a child." "I will, and to think, as maybe yet, of Susan having to do with the child's mother, for she is tender and pitiful and speaks hopefully of my lost one and will try to find her for me when she comes, as she does sometimes, to thrust money under the door for her baby. Think of that, Will. Here's Susan, good and pure as the angels in heaven, yet like them, full of hope and mercy, and one who, like them, will rejoice over she who repents. Will, my lad, I'm not afeard of you now, and I must speak, and you must listen. I'm your mother, and I dare command you, because I know I am in the right, and God is on my side. If he should lead the poor wandering lassie to Susan's door, and she comes back crying and sorrowful, led by that good angel to us once more, thou shalt never say a casting up word to her about her sin, but be tender and helpful towards one who was lost and is found. So may God's blessing rest on thee, and so mayest thou lead Susan home as thy wife." She stood, no longer the meek, imploring, gentle mother, but firm and dignified, as if the interpreter of God's will. Her manner was so unusual and solemn that it overcame all Will's pride and stubbornness. He rose swiftly while she was speaking, and he bent his head as if in reverence at her words and her solemn injunction which they conveyed. When she had spoken, he said in so subdued a voice she was almost surprised, "Mother, I will. I may be dead and gone, but all the same thou wilt take home the wandering sinner and heal up her sorrows and lead her to her father's house. My lad, I can speak no more. I've turned very faint." He placed her in a chair, and he ran for water. She opened her eyes and smiled. "Bless you, Will. Oh, I'm so happy. It seems as if she were found, my heart is so full of gladness." That night, Mr. Palmer stayed out late and long. Susan was afraid that he was at his old haunts and habits, getting tipsy in some public house, and this thought oppressed her, even though she had so much to make her happy. The consciousness that Will loved her. She sat up long, and then she went to bed, leaving all arranged as well as she could for her father's return. She looked at the little rosy sleeping girl who was her bedfellow with redoubled tenderness, and with many a prayerful thought. The little arms entwined her neck as she lay down, for Nanny was a light sleeper, and was conscious that she, who was loved with all the power of that sweet childish heart, was near and close by her, although she was too sleepy to utter any half-formed words. And by, Susan heard her father come home, stumbling and uncertain, trying first the windows and next the door fastenings, with many a loud and incoherent murmur. The little innocent twined around her seemed all the sweeter and more lovely when she thought sadly of her erring father. And presently he called aloud for a light. She had left matches, all arranged as usual on the dresser, but fearful of some accident from fire, in his unusually intoxicated state, she now got up softly, and putting on a cloak, went to his assistance. Alas, the little arms that were unclosed from her soft neck belonged to a light, easily awakened sleeper. Nanny missed her darling Susie, and terrified at being left alone in the darkness, which had no bounds and seemed infinite, slipped out of bed and tottered in her little nightgown towards the door. There was a light below, and there was Susie, and safety. She went onwards 2 steps towards the steep, abrupt stairs, and then, dazzled with sleepiness, she stood and wavered and fell. Down on her head on the stone floor she fell. Susan flew to her and spoke all soft, entreating, loving words, but her white-lipped lids covered up the blue violets of her eyes, and no murmur came out of the pale lips. The warm tears that rained down did not awaken her. She lay stiff and weary with her short life on Susan's knee. Susan went sick with terror. She carried her upstairs and laid her tenderly in bed. She dressed herself most hastily with her trembling fingers. Her father was asleep on the settle downstairs and useless, worse than useless if awake. But Susan flew out of the door and down the quiet, resounding street towards the nearest doctor's house. Quickly she went, but as quickly a shadow followed, as if impelled by some sudden terror. Susan rang wildly at the night bell, and the shadow crouched near, and the doctor looked out from an upstairs window. "A little child has fallen down the stairs at number 9 Crown Street and is very ill. Dying, I'm afraid. Please, for God's sake, sir, come directly. Number 9 Crown Street." "I'll be there directly," he said, and shut the window. "For that God you have spoken about, for his sake, tell me, are you Susan Palmer? Is it my child that lies a-dying?" said the shadow, springing forwards and clutching poor Susan's arm. "It is a child of 2 years old, and I do not know whose it is. I love it as if it were my own. Come with me, whoever you are, come with me." The two sped along the silent streets, as silent as the night they were. They entered the house. Susan snatched up the light and carried it upstairs, and the other followed. She stood with wild, glaring eyes by the bedside, never looking at Susan, but hungrily gazing at the little, white, still child. She stooped down and put her hand tight to her own heart, as if to still its beating, and bent her ear to the pale lips. Whatever the result was, she did not speak, but threw off the bedclothes wherewith Susan had tenderly covered up the little creature, and felt its left side. Then she threw her arms with a cry of wild despair. "She's dead! She's dead!" She looked so fierce, so mad, so haggard, that for an instant Susan was terrified. The next, God put courage into her heart, and her pure arms were round that guilty, wretched creature, and her tears were falling just as fast as the other. But she was thrown off with violence. "You killed her! You slighted her! You let her fall down those stairs! You killed her!" Susan cleared off the thick mist before her, and gazing at the mother with her clear, sweet angel eyes, said, "I would have laid my own life down for her." "Oh, the murder's on my soul!" exclaimed the wild, bereaved mother, with the fierce impetuousness of one who has none to love her and to be loved, regard to whom might teach self-restraint. "Hush," said Susan. "Here's the doctor. God may suffer her to live." The poor mother turned sharp round. The doctor mounted the stair. Ah, that mother was right. The little child was truly dead and gone. And when he confirmed her judgment, the mother fell down into a fit. Susan, with her deep grief, had to forget herself and forget her darling and question the doctor about what she must do with the poor wretch who lay on the floor in such extremes of misery. "She is the mother." "Why did she not take better care of her child?" he said almost angrily. But Susan only said, "The little child slept with me, and it was I that left her." "I will go and make up a composing draught, and while I am away you must get her to bed." Susan took out some of her own clothes and softly undressed the stiff form. There was no other bed in the house but the one in which her father slept. She tenderly lifted the body of her darling child and was going to take it downstairs, but the mother opened the eyes and, seeing what she was doing, said, "I'm not worthy to touch her. I'm so wicked. I've spoken to you as I never should have spoken, but I think you are very good. May I have my own child to lie in my arms for a little while?" Her voice was so strange a contrast to what it had been before she had gone into the fit that Susan hardly recognized it. It was now so unspeakably soft, so pleading. Her features, too, had lost their fierce expression and were almost as placid as death. Susan could not speak, but she carried the little child and laid it in its mother's arms. Then, as she looked at them, something overpowered her, and she knelt down, crying aloud, "Oh, have mercy on her and forgive and comfort her." But the mother kept smiling and stroking the little face, murmuring tender words as though it were alive. She was going mad, Susan thought, but she prayed on, and prayed with streaming eyes. The doctor came in with the draught. The mother took it with a docile unconsciousness of its nature as medicine. The doctor sat by her, and soon she fell asleep. Then he rose softly and, beckoning Susan to the door, spoke to her there. "You must take the corpse out of her arms. She will not awake. The draught will make her sleep for many hours. I will call before noon. It is now daylight. Goodbye." Susan shut him out. Then, gently extracting the dead child from its mother's arms, she could not resist making her own quiet moan over her darling. She tried to learn off of its placid face, pale in front of her. Not all the scalding tears of care shall wash away that vision fair, not all the thousand thoughts that rise, not all the sights that dim her eyes, shall e'er usurp the place of that little angel face. And then she remembered what remained to be done. She saw that all was right in the house. Her father was still dead asleep on the settle, in spite of the noise of the night. She went through the quiet streets, deserted still, although it was broad daylight, to where the Leighs live. Mrs. Leigh, who kept her country house, was opening her winter shutters. Susan took her by the arm and without speaking went into the house. There, she knelt down before the astonished Mrs. Leigh and cried as she had never done before, but the miserable night had overpowered her, and she who had gone through so much calmly, now that the pressure seemed removed, could not find the power in her to speak. "My poor dear, what has made thy heart so sore as to come and cry at this uns? Speak and tell me. Nay, cry on, poor wretch. If thou canst not speak yet, it will ease the heart, and then thou canst tell me." "Nanny's dead," said Susan. "I left her to go to father, and she fell down the stairs and never breathed again. Oh, that's my sorrow, but I've more to tell. Her mother is at our house. Come and see if it's your Lizzie." Mrs. Leigh could not speak, but trembling put on her things and went with Susan in a haste back to Crown Street. And that is the end of chapter 3, but I think, like I said, we're going to finish this. I didn't realize there was a 4th chapter, but it's fairly short. And yeah, we're just going to go ahead and finish it after I grab a drink. All right, and now chapter 4 of Lizzie Leigh by Elizabeth, I can't remember, Gaskell. As they entered the house in Crown Street, they perceived that the door would not open freely on its hinges, and Susan instinctively looked behind to see the cause of the obstruction. She immediately recognized the appearance of a little parcel wrapped in a scrap of newspaper and evidently containing money. She stooped and picked it up. "Look," she said, "the mother was bringing this for her child last night." But Mrs. Leigh did not answer. So near to the ascertaining if it were her lost child or not, she could not be arrested, but pressed onwards with trembling steps and a beating, fluttering heart. She entered the bedroom, dark and still. She took no heed of the little corpse over which Susan paused, but she went straight to the bed and, withdrawing the curtain, saw Lizzie, but not the former Lizzie, bright, gay, buoyant, and undimmed. This Lizzie was old before her time. Her beauty was gone. Deep lines of care and, alas, of want were printed on the cheeks, so round, fair, and smooth, when last she had gladdened her mother's eyes. Even in her sleep, she bore the look of woe and despair, which was the prevalent expression of her face by day. Even in her sleep, she had forgotten how to smile, but all these marks of sin and sorrow she had passed through only made her mother love her more. She stood looking at her with greedy eyes, which seemed as though no gazing could satisfy their longing, and at last she stooped and kissed the pale, worn hand that lay outside the bedclothes. No touch disturbed the sleeper. The mother need not have laid the hand so gently upon the counterpane. There was no sign of life, save only now and then a deep, sobbing sigh. Mrs. Leigh sat down beside the bed and, still holding back the curtain, looked on as though she could never be satisfied. Susan would fain have stayed by her darling one, but she had many calls upon her time and thoughts, and her will had now, as ever, to be given to that of others. All seemed to devolve the burden of their cares on her. Her father, ill-humored from last night's intemperance, did not scruple to reproach her with being the cause of little Nanny's death, and when, after hearing his upbraiding meekly for some time, she could no longer restrain herself, but began to cry, he wounded her even more by his injudicious attempts at comfort, for he said all that was well as the child was dead. It was not one of theirs, and why should they be troubled with it? Susan wrung her hands at this, and came and stood before her father, and implored him to forbear. Then she had to take all the requisite steps for the coroner's inquest. She had to arrange for the dismissal of her school. She had to summon a little neighbor and send his willing feet on a message to William Leigh, who she felt ought to be informed of his mother's whereabouts and the whole state of affairs. She asked her messenger to tell him to come and speak to her, that his mother was at her house. She was thankful that her father sauntered out to have a gossip at the nearest coach stand and to relate as many of the night's adventures as he knew, for as yet he was in ignorance of the watcher and the watched who silently passed the hours upstairs. At dinner time, Will came. He looked red, glad, impatient, and excited. Susan stood white and calm before him, her soft, loving eyes gazing straight into his. "Will," she said, "your sister is upstairs." "My sister?" he said, as of one affrighted at the idea, and losing his glad look into one of gloom. Susan saw it, and her heart sank a little, but she went as calm as ever. "She was little Nanny's mother, as perhaps you know. Poor little Nanny was killed last night by a fall down the stairs." All of her calmness was gone. All of the suppressed feeling was displayed in spite of her efforts. She sat down and hid her face from him and cried bitterly. He forgot everything but the wish and the longing to comfort her. He put his arm round her and bent over her, but all he could say was, "Oh, Susan, how can I comfort you? Don't take on so. Pray don't." He never changed the words, but the tone varied every time he spoke. At last she seemed to regain her power over herself and wiped her eyes and once more looked upon him with her own quiet, earnest, unfearing gaze. "Your sister was near the house. She came in on hearing my words to the doctor. She is asleep now and your mother is watching her. I wanted to tell you all myself. Would you like to see your mother?" "No," he said. "I would rather see none but thee. Mother told me that thou knewest all." His eyes were downcast in shame. But the holy and pure did not lower or veil her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I know all but her suffering. Think what it must have been." He answered low and stern, "She deserved them all, every jot." "In the eye of God, perhaps she does. He is the judge, we are not." "Oh," she said with a burst, "Will Leigh, I have thought so well of you. Don't go and make me think you cruel and hard. Goodness is not goodness unless there is mercy and tenderness. There is your mother, who has been nearly heartbroken, now full of rejoicing over her child. Think of her." "I do think of her," he said. "I remember the promise I gave her last night. Thou shouldst give me time. I would do right in time. I never think it o'er in quiet, but I will do what is right and fitting, never fear. Thou hast spoken out very plain to me, and misdoubted me, Susan. I love thee so that thy words they cut me. If I did hang back a bit from making sudden promises, it was not for even love of thee. Would I say not what I was fearing, and at first I could not feel at once that thou wouldst have me. But I'm not cruel and hard, for if I had been, I should never have grieved as I have done." He made as if he were going away, and indeed he did feel he would rather think it over in quiet. But Susan, grieved by her words, which had all the appearance of harshness, went a step or two nearer to him and paused, then, over blushes, said, "Will, I beg your pardon. I'm very sorry. Won't you forgive me?" She, who had always drawn back and been so reserved, said this in the softest manner, with eyes now uplifted beseechingly and now on the ground. Her sweet confusion told more than words could, and Will turned back, joyous in his certainty of being beloved, and took her in his arms and kissed her. My own Susan. Meanwhile, the mother watched her child in the room above. It was late in the afternoon before she awoke, for the sleeping draught had been powerful. The instant she awoke, her eyes were fixed on her mother's face with a gaze as unflinching as though fascinated. Mrs. Leigh did not turn away or move, for it seemed as if motion would unlock a command over herself which, while so perfectly still, she was enabled to preserve. But by and by Lizzie cried out in a piercing voice of agony, "Mother, don't look at me. I've been so wicked," and instantly hid her face and groveled among the bedclothes and lay like one dead, she was so motionless. Mrs. Leigh knelt by the bed and spoke in the most soothing tones. "Lizzie, dear, don't speak so. I'm thy mother, darling. Don't be afeard of me. I never left off loving thee, Lizzie. I was always thinking of thee. Thy father forgave thee afore he died." There was a little start there, but no sound to be heard. "Lizzie, lass, I'll do aught for thee. I'll live for thee. Only don't be afeard of me. Whatever thou art or has been, we'll never speak on it. We'll leave the bad times behind us and go back to Upclose Farm. I but left it to find thee, my lass, and God has led me to thee. And this is good, Lizzie. Thou hast not forgotten thy Bible, I'll be bound. Thou wert always a scholar. I'm no reader, but I learnt off them texts to comfort me a bit, and I've said them many time a day to myself. Lizzie, lass, don't hide thy head. It's thy mother speaking to thee. Thy little child clung to me only yesterday, and if it's gone to be an angel, it will speak to God for thee. Nay, don't sob that. Thou shalt have the child again in heaven. I know thou'lt strive to get there for little Nanny's sake. And listen, I'll tell thee God's promises to them that are penitent. Just don't be afeard." Mrs. Leigh folded her hands and strove to speak clearly, while she repeated every tender, merciful text that she could remember. She could tell from the breathing that her daughter was listening, but she was dizzy and sick herself when she had ended and could not go on speaking. It was all she could do to keep from crying. At last she heard her daughter's voice. "Where have they taken her to?" "She's downstairs. So quiet and peaceful and happy she looks." "Could she speak? Oh, but that I might have heard her little voice. Mother, I used to dream of it. May I see her once again? Mother, if I strive very hard, and God is merciful, and I go to heaven, I shall not know her. I shall not know her. She will shun me as a stranger, and cling to Susan Palmer and you. Woe!" In her earnestness, she had uncovered her face and tried to read Mrs. Leigh's thoughts through her looks. And when she saw those old eyes brimming with tears and marked the quivering lips, she threw her arms around her faithful mother's neck and wept as she had done many a time in childish sorrow, but with a deep, more wretched grief. Her mother hushed her and lulled her as though she were a baby, and she grew still and quiet. They sat like this for a long time. At last Susan Palmer came up with some tea and bread and butter for Mrs. Leigh. She watched the mother feed her sick, unwilling child with every fond inducement to eat that which she could devise, and they neither of them took notice of Susan's presence. That night they lay in each other's arms, but Susan slept on the ground next to them. They took the little corpse, the little unconscious sacrifice, whose early calling home had reclaimed her poor wandering mother to the hills, in which her life she had never been able to see. They dared not lay her by her stern grandfather in the Miller Row churchyard, but they bore her to a lone moorland graveyard where once long ago the Quakers used to bury their dead. They laid her there on the sunny slope where the early spring flowers blow. Will and Susan live at Upclose Farm. Mrs. Leigh and Lizzie dwell in a cottage so secluded that until you drop into the hollow where it's placed, you don't see it. Tom is a schoolmaster in Rochdale, and he and Will help support their mother. I only know that if the cottage be hidden in a green hollow of the hills, every sound of sorrow in the whole upland is heard there. Every call of suffering or sickness for help is listened to by a sad, gentle-looking woman who rarely smiles. And when she does, her smile is more sad than others' tears. But she comes out of her seclusion whenever there's a shadow in any household. Many hearts bless Lizzie Leigh, but she prays always and ever for forgiveness, such forgiveness as may enable her to see her child once more. Mrs. Leigh is quiet and happy. Lizzie is to her eyes something precious, as the lost piece of silver found again. Susan is the bright one who brings sunshine to all. Children grow around her and call her blessed. One is named Nanny. Her, Lizzie, often takes to the sunny graveyard in the uplands, and while the little one gathers daisies and makes daisy chain, Lizzie sits by a little grave and weeps bitter. That was a story that none of that story went in any direction that I thought it was going to go in. I don't know that I necessarily liked that story. It definitely felt very moralistic and probably very much of its time. I don't know what I think about that one. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of that story. And, interesting. Anyway, we have one more story in this book that we will check in on the next time. I'm kind of curious as to how this one's going to go. Again, it's got a couple different chapters, so we'll read it over a couple different nights. And it is The Miner's Daughters, A Tale of the Peak. Hopefully it won't be quite so moralistic. I don't know what I thought of that one. Interesting. Anyway, let me know what you thought of Lizzie Leigh in the comments down below, and I will see you next time.